All right, welcome everybody to our webinar today. We are super excited to kick off our series for 2026 in bringing closer the IMF and climate change to a broader audience of society. The purpose of these webinars is to make this complex and kind of towering institution of the IMF more approachable, more understandable, understand how debt and climate justice issues are connected and why the IMF as an institution continues to play such a big role in undermining both of them. And we have a really exciting group of speakers today that is going to kick us off with situating the current context of multilateralism and what is happening, not just at the IMF, but also in the wider field, institutional field, around it, and other decision-making spaces that impact debt and climate justice issues, such as financing for development, such as the COP and the UNFCCC, where decisions around climate are made, but also increasingly connected to so-called enablers and other factors in the financial architecture that are crucial for making climate action happen. And so I'm going to, without much further ado, hand over the mic to our wonderful moderator, Mariana Paoli, this week still with Christian Aid, and she will introduce our speakers and take us off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Federica, and hello, everyone. As I think this initiative is quite timely, and I'm very happy that a number of this series of webinars will be organized this year, especially because 2026 is a year of resistance with major challenges for the multilateral system in the current geopolitical context. So more than anything else, especially I guess with the rise of the right and far right, both the climate and development agendas are under threat, not just because of Trump, but also how the EU is also blocking a lot of the progressive reforms on the multilateral spaces. So when we're coming to that discussion on the nexus of the climate and debt, we're still looking into the current financial architecture that was designed and controlled by the global north to serve their interests. So unless a meaningful global financial architecture reform democratize economic decision making and give us more voice and participation to the global south, will be really difficult to challenge the norms in which they were currently built. We cannot achieve climate justice without the debt justice and without dismantling the market logic of the system that was a Washington consensus now, a climate Washington consensus, as Gabor says, that actually is hindering and not helping the climate and development agendas based in the interests of the global south. I'm very happy that we're going to hear in this webinar from different perspectives, connecting the dots between different processes, which are very much interconnected around not just the Bretton Woods institutions, focusing on the IMF, but also FFD for outcomes and what it means next, and the UN climate talks, of course. So yes, we're going to start with Yolanda Fresnillo from Eurodad, who's going to walk us through what FFD4 outcomes mean and for us and our work and the UN International Financial Architecture Reforms Initiative. So Yolanda, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you to Federica and the colleagues in the Recourse for setting this up. I agree with Mariana. It's really timely to have this discussion. I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see if I can do that. If I manage to do that. Oh God. Okay. It's this one. Okay. This one. Do you see?
Yes, we see now your web browser.
Yeah. Not the right one, definitely.
At least the right sharing button, but not yet the right window, perhaps.
Okay. How can I share this? Here it is. Okay. Now you should see a presentation.
Yeah,
okay,
we do.
great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay, so the idea is to present a little bit about how the IMF relates to UN FFD4 through the issues of debt and climate. My idea is to explain a little bit of a background, then go directly into the IMF role in FFD4 and what are the outcomes of the FFD have any implication to the IMF or how the IMF reacts to those agreements. And first and foremost, and I think in many occasions we start these discussions around the IMF and the UN stating the obvious, but the IMF is part of the UN system. The IMF is a specialized agency within the UN system, the same as the World Bank, the same as the International Labour Organization, the same as World Health Organizations. If people don't believe that, I posted the link to the UN website that states all of the specialized agencies listing the IMF, the World Bank, so they are part of the UN system. Regardless of that, particularly the IMF, the World Bank as well, acts with total disregard to the UN system, to the system they belong to. They disregard the decisions that are being made at the UN by member states with a of member states and the decisions that are being made at the IMF itself. They state over and over again that they are not obliged to follow or analyze human rights impacts of their policies as if they weren't subject to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They keep or the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and as part of the UN system, they are definitely need to follow the international agreements agreed under that umbrella. Not only because they are part of the UN system, but also because they are states that sign those declarations, covenants, statements, and international agreements. So when you hear some IMF board members questioning whether the institution is subject to the Paris Agreement, the obvious answer is yes, it is. It has to be subject to the Paris Agreement because of the two reasons: because they are part of the UN system, but also because of their membership having signed to the Paris Agreement. They disregard the UN by ignoring specific agreements in UN conferences. And here there's one that is particularly relevant for today's discussion. I don't know if people remember the Summit of the Future, this thing that many of us criticized because of being a sideshow that didn't really spur a member state-led process. Nonetheless, there was an agreement in that summit mandating the IMF to undertake a review of ways to strengthen and improve sovereign debt architecture. I passed it in the presentation. I'll share the presentation later. Passed it in the presentation, the exact agreement signed by most member states. I think it was all of them at the time, except for Argentina. It was the time when the US still supported these processes, with particular deadlines. A deadline in December last year, another deadline in March this year. Obviously, the IMF hasn't done that. They published a debt architecture review focusing on private creditors last year, and we asked, like, is this the response to the Pact of the Future mandate, and the answer we got from the IMF was no. And we still don't have any plans to do this, because if it was the response, it was definitely not comprehensive enough. So they knew that our question was a bit tricky. But no, they have an answer to that, a specific mandate agreed by all member states to do a review of the debt architecture. Not that we as civil society want the IMF to do the review of the debt architecture, we wouldn't like that, but it's an example of how they disregard UN agreements. And they do that while favoring informal, non-inclusive forums like the G20. G20 is nothing. The G20 is not an institution. It's an informal club of rich and middle-income countries. The G7 is an informal club of 7 rich countries. The Paris Club is an informal forum of creditors. None of these spaces and forums are actual institutions. They are all creditor-dominated, and they are the institutions that the IMF looks at for instance, governing the debt issue. And if it wasn't enough, they create parallel spaces, also informal, also non-inclusive, like the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, instead of supporting member state democratic inclusive processes to reform the international financial architecture, and particularly the debt architecture. And one last point that sometimes we don't see, but through our connections with other UN agencies, they exert an excessive influence through their power to lower ambition on joint processes with other UN agencies. One clear example is there is an annual Interagency Task Force Financing for Sustainable Development report. This is a report that the UN publishes every year, analyzing the evolution and the state of the financing for development issues. The IMF is part of this interagency task force because they are part of the UN, as I said. But they use their power to lower the ambition, to even censor some of the proposals that other agencies like UNCTAD try to include in these reports. Sometimes we have progressive proposals in these reports because there's a fight back from other UN agencies, but what we know is that the IMF tries to undermine the content of this report. Last year, in the face of the Financing for Development conference, the IMF, also the World Bank, published a report on FFD, on financing for development. They stated that there are major development challenges behind and ahead of low-income countries in particular, that the SDGs are out of reach. That it's clearly stated in their report. That they want to pay attention to debt vulnerabilities, particularly in low-income countries, that this is something that people should be worried about. But when it comes to making proposals, it's business as usual. Is there surveillance? Is there monitoring? I think Federico's going to talk about some of this. Is there conditional lending? Is focusing on domestic efforts. So all of these problems, SDGs being out of reach, debt vulnerabilities, seem to be a problem of global south countries not being able to manage efficiently enough their resources, not the imbalanced trade, the imbalanced economic relations, the imbalance of powers, the structural inheritances of the colonial era. Nothing of that matters. It's just that, through some capacity building, through some advice from the guys from Washington, countries should be more efficient in managing their affairs, and then they will overcome these major challenges. That is the rhetoric that comes out of the report. Obviously, no debt cancellation. They say, well, there's a need to improve the debt restructuring. We have the common framework, which is this very failed system that the G20 put together. And what they call the three-pillar approach, structural reforms to boost growth, as if the structural reforms imposed throughout the years by the IMF actually had any success. Advancing development, fostering external financial support, so more lending, and reducing debt service burdens by guarantees and risk sharing, so kind of taking care of the private sector not taking any actual risks, and ask them politely if they want to lower a little bit the costs that they push into global south countries.
Yolanda, sorry, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm out of time.
Thank you.
Okay. What happened at the F54 and what's the IMF role? I'm just gonna highlight 3 things, and you have all of the information in the slide. We wanted the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt to have a democratic governance of the debt architecture. We didn't get it. We got an intergovernmental process, but also a dialogue with the IMF and the World Bank. And that was the EU and the US, not so much the US, but the EU, the UK, pressuring to have the IMF and the World Bank and the Paris Club on top of those processes. We asked for debt restructuring mechanism. We didn't get it. It's just the reinforcement of the common framework and the IMF blocking any kind of debt restructuring mechanism under UN auspices. We asked for binding responsible lending and borrowing principles. We got a working group on responsible lending and borrowing principles with the IMF and the World Bank. So hope we don't expect much from these groups. There are other things I can share. This one last thing. We got the Borrowers Club. There was an agreement on a borrowers platform. This is something that we haven't heard the IMF commenting on. The borrowers platform has decided to use the next spring meetings to launch their platform. So it's something that we should be looking at. Thank you, and sorry for taking so long.
No worries. Thank you so much for taking us through that. Indeed, I think it was one of the key processes last year, which, as you have shown, really provides the different avenues to continue on that conversation. But also, I guess we are coming from the hangover from Baku the previous year, where the new collective financial goal was approved, and actually how the role of Bretton Woods institutions, including the IMF, were boosted within those conversations, and to some extent challenges we've seen in the finance agenda in Berlin during the COP30. So I would like to invite Zahed Rashad from CSE in India to take us through a bit of the UN climate talks and the agenda around the international financial architecture reform. So, Seth, over to you.
Can you hear me? Hello. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Mariana. Thanks, everyone, for putting this together. Very pertinent. I'll just jump right into it. So I'll be covering...
I'm sorry. I don't know if it's just me, but I think your voice is a bit low. If you could just maybe with the mic a bit closer. Thank you.
Maybe this is a little better.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine. So yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'll just jump right into it. I'll be covering 2 main things today. One is what is the debt climate link, very broadly, because I know there are several experts who can speak to this at length over here, and then jump into what is happening in the UNFCCC space with respect to IFA reform, including debt. So first of all, last year, CSE, which is the Center for Science and Environment, where I work, we published a fact sheet called Debt's Climate Link ahead of F54. And we really just tried to give a lay of the land and make the interlinkages between sovereign debt, the climate crisis, and what needs to be done for the global south. So just a couple of highlights from this analysis to ground the kind of discussion that we're having today. We found that LMICs, or low and middle income countries, whose external debt exceeded 50% of their GNI, doubled between 2013 and 2023, the number of countries. And we also found that in 2022 and 2023, developing countries cumulatively paid around 38.5 billion more to their external creditors than they received in fresh loan disbursements, resulting in what has been framed and is now known as a net negative resource transfer. So that's just the debt part. And then we zoomed into the climate aspects and how that links in. First of all, an interesting data point was that the total external climate finance needs for LMICs, excluding China, stood, and these are older estimates, stood at about 1,000 billion, right? That these countries need an estimated 1,000 billion USD in external finance on an annual basis to meet their climate action needs. But the total external debt service that was being done by LMICs, excluding China, in 2023 totaled 970 billion. Essentially, this group of countries are spending nearly the same amount as their climate finance needs each year on external debt servicing alone. And these are not small figures. We narrowed the focus further on extremely climate vulnerable countries. So over half of this group of countries, which were 36 in number, over half of these LMICs, which were highly climate vulnerable, we found that they were either already in debt distress or at a high risk of it. So cumulatively, this group of 36 highly climate vulnerable countries, they received about 78 billion in climate related development finance, which is broader than climate ODA because it includes both concessional and non-concessional. It's a slightly wider estimate. So they received around 78 billion as climate related development finance between 2011 and 2022, which means on average per year, we're looking at an inflow of around 7.17 billion per year. But their costed needs, and we did this calculation on our own based on the NDCs submitted by them, amounted to around 79 billion per year. So if 7 is what was flowing in the form of CRDF, the needs of these countries on an annual basis actually stood at 79 billion. And in 2022, which was the latest year for which we looked at the data and was available publicly, this group of countries spent 13.24 billion on external public debt service, which is 1.8 times higher than what they received as CRDF annually. So essentially, this is not new analysis, but every set of analysis that tries to look at first the burgeoning debt crisis, and then the climate needs and the climate vulnerability and the climate spending and climate finance received keeps pointing to the fact that what is required is far more than what is coming in, and the debt distress is preventing these countries from spending adequately and forcing them to choose between their developmental goals and their climate goals. So this is kind of an interlinking of multiple crises. And I will note that while climate-related development finance is not the sole or dominant climate finance channel, it's globally harmonized in its tagging, and its disaggregated availability of data made it the proxy of choice for our study. So essentially, the climate crisis, in order to be addressed, also needs a very close look at the debt crisis. And now I'll get into my second issue, zooming into the UNFCCC space with respect to IFA reform, including debt issues. So I think the formal discussions, or most of the discussions on IFA reform, have been taking place under the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement for the last couple of years. This is basically that article of the Paris Agreement which talks about the need to align all finance flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement, including limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2 degrees at the very least. So at COP30 in Belém last year, we saw that after a series of dialogues, the outcome on 2.1c manifested as two things: the Veredas dialogues and the Chingu talks. Now, essentially, these are different fora, and their details are actually yet to be decided for the year ahead. But these are basically attempts to continue a structured engagement on the conversation on aligning finance flows, including with actors that are beyond the UNFCCC. Because everyone on this call, and I'm sure everyone listening, knows that while there is a need to reform various aspects of the international financial architecture, particularly for climate, the actors that are really driving the decisions and driving this reform don't really sit within the climate space as such. So this is, I guess, cautiously optimistic stance would say that this is a good thing, that there is at least a hook to continue this kind of discussion within the UNFCCC. And as far as the Sharm el Sheikh dialogues or the talks until now are concerned, what they did not manage to do was convene on scope, on what it really means to align, finance flows with the Paris Agreement by the end of maybe 3 years. But some useful insights, or at least some useful acknowledgement of issues beyond the provision of climate finance, was done in this space, including that alignment of finance flows cannot be separated from macroeconomic realities. Now, this includes the questions of sovereign debt, of fiscal space, and of high cost of capital, which is higher for countries in the global south, particularly for technologies essential for decarbonization. And an insight that I find particularly interesting, and there's a growing discussion on this right now, is also that merely identifying and reporting climate risks by financial actors has also been found to not be enough. It's 10 years post the Paris Agreement now, and we've been seeing a lot of task forces and a lot of emphasis on disclosures over the last couple of years. But this hasn't actually led to a significant increase in finance flowing to the sectors that need it for decarbonization. So 2.1C or Paris alignment or IFA reform within the UNFCCC context has included conversations on the need to reduce finance flowing towards fossil fuels, but also acknowledging that it's important to ensure to make structural tweaks to ensure that the finance for clean activities or climate-friendly, climate-consistent activities also actually increases. The second point I wanted to make in the UNFCCC and IFA linkage would be that even though the new collective quantified goal, or the NCQG, which was decided at Baku in COP29, was not an IFA goal or directly or technically speaking, but any kind of goal for the provision of climate finance is situated in the international financial architecture that the world operates in. And so all of the negotiations and all the technical expert dialogues that actually led up to the negotiations in Baku also acknowledged this. And it acknowledged and actually underlined the gaps that affect such a goal, including, once again, sovereign debt, cost of capital. Countries or the country grouping of the like-minded developing countries, I think, gave it very interesting phrasing at one point in the talks leading up to Baku, while calling it global disenablers. So this was also given a spotlight throughout. So at COP29 and actually at COP30, a follow-up from this NCQG and all the negotiations was also the B2B roadmap within the UNFCCC. This was a roadmap to reach 1.3 trillion, which basically tried to bring about many IFA-related threads in its final report. And though it was critiqued, rightly so, for having a heavy private finance first approach, which has been proven to not necessarily work for development and more so for climate, it tried to do this contextualizing and bringing in of IFA reform into the climate finance conversation, particularly through its 5 R's framing. And the 5 R's were reform, relief, rechanneling, risk sharing, and raising finance. So essentially, this report or the B2B roadmap talked about MDB reform, debt relief, restructuring, rechanneling of SDRs, more blended instruments, and scaling up public and mobilized private capital. But a key critique that remains, and CSC's position on this is also this, that while the roadmap may have broadened the narrative or attempted to, it fizzled out right after COP30, after the first couple of days, and it did not really embed any binding accountability or quantified pathways, which was a very strong civil society and developing country ask up until Belém, in all the various discussions. And some of us were even a part of those consultations leading up to COP30, right? So it left much of the ambition.
Sorry, 1 minute.
Yeah, it left much of the ambition dependent on voluntary action and just political will. So when we're talking about what the UNFCCC can or cannot do, I think I just laid out how the official or formal channels where that conversation on IFA reform was actually happening, what was the latest at COP30. And I also just wanted to flag that advocacy and civil society groups have been trying to raise the bar by focusing on the linkages with sovereign debt and why public finance is still necessary to take any kind of meaningful climate action forward. And just as an aside before I end, I think while critiquing a heavily private finance first approach is necessary, it is also true that EMDs or emerging markets understand the need for private finance mobilization, particularly given the current geopolitical constraints. So, but even that mobilization requires public finance guarantees, risk mitigation, and essentially a lot of safeguards in place. So we cannot, I don't think it's useful anymore to do a blanket criticism, but to really try and engage with how to make it work for the global south in a more just and fair way. I know many people will think that's an oxymoron, but I just wanted to bring that in for maybe discussion as we go forward. So yeah, and last point, at COP30, almost all discussions on increasing accountability related to the NCQG and its links in the context of IFA were reduced or blocked. But the 21C space and the Veritas dialogue and continuation of discussion with actors beyond UNFCCC or climate ministers gives some hope, and there's some hooks that civil society and other actors can hopefully use to kind of keep pushing this agenda and acknowledging that the IFA is the world that we operate in, and that needs to be addressed in order to facilitate meaningful climate action. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, there were 18 finance agendas in Berlin, and you did an outstanding job in just whizzing us through the key ones. So thank you for that, and the connection, therefore, what we're talking here in terms of the IMF. So that's where I wanted to bring us back to, because this year there are a number of reviews taking place. And I think to do that, I would like to invite Federico Sibaja from Recourse to take us through this, for then to us to take stock a bit and how it reverts also to what Seth was just mentioning in terms of UNFCCC and what Yolanda also covered on in terms of FF54. Federico, over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. I hope you can see my screen. Thank you, Mariana. Great to see people nodding. And thank you, everyone involved in the organization of this. I think I'm going to start with this one actually before going to the reviews. Just to echo a little bit what Yolanda was saying at the beginning. Why is it? I mean, many people that maybe haven't been following IMF developments in the last few years may wonder why is it that we're still discussing the IMF? If it's still, I mean, if we're not in the 90s, we're not in the 80s in the structural adjustment period. Actually, as we can see here in this graph from the World Bank, I will later share the presentation with the links. Since COVID, the flows, as Sarah was saying, the flows from bondholders, short-term creditors have left. In this case, it's IDA countries, so mostly low-income countries, and these have been replaced by the IFIs. As Yolanda briefly mentioned, this is also part of the three-pillar approach, which is the response to the debt crisis that came after COVID. And here in this graph, you can see the graph is from 2024. You can see all of the countries that were under IMF arrangements in 2024. This means, of course, countries where the IMF, an institution where governments of the global north, of the global south, or where governments from the global north have a big voting power, are represented and have a huge say over countries' economic policies. This, of course, means the fiscal space for development, for climate action. And the relevance of having this discussion in this moment is because the IMF right now is reviewing two of the policies that guide two of the three main activities that it does. There's technical assistance, there's surveillance, and there's lending. So the comprehensive surveillance review that is taking place right now, I mean, both processes will be wrapped up. Supposedly, the plan is for them to be wrapped up by October, when the IMF is holding its annual meetings in Thailand. Every 3 years, the IMF holds its annual meetings outside Washington, D.C. And in general, this is the opportunity. I mean, the institution tries to show how much progress it's doing, how useful an institution it is, and that's why they're trying to wrap up these processes by October. The surveillance review in this opportunity is quite important, given it's the first follow-up to the review that happened in 2021. In COVID, where everyone, I mean, the discussion was about green recovery, build back better, and all of those things that didn't really materialize, unfortunately, in the last few years. And back then, the IMF decided to start working. I mean, one of the priorities of this process was economic sustainability. And under that, the institution that so far had focused mostly on the short term and on being a firefighter and on only addressing emergencies and just slashing fiscal budgets in order to ensure debt repayment and for countries not to go to default in the context of a weak debt architecture where countries prefer to go to the IMF rather than defaulting. One of the priorities there was to operationalize this economic sustainability priority through the climate strategy, and that was mostly focused on surveillance. We'll then discuss what happened with lending. And in the case of the review of conditionalities, this is the policy that guides the lending that the IMF does in the program design, and this will be the first one since 2018. It's not a process that happens that often, and it's also the first review that happens since the IMF has been present in so many countries for a long while. And of course, I mean, you may have heard and may have read in the last few years, I mean, since the latest big IMF intervention 10 years ago, when we had the Southern European debt crisis in Greece, in Spain, where the IMF came in and came in through big programs. Austerity was a little bit questioned back then, and the IMF has been trying to clean up its image, saying that it's not the same institution that it has been. There's some big quotes from Christine Lagarde and the current managing director in this regard, but the evidence shows that actually the IMF continues to push programs that include extremely harsh fiscal austerity targets in the context of a development and climate crisis. What we found was, in the case of IMF programs in general, average fiscal austerity being asked was more than 3% of GDP, and this was even worse in the case of low-income countries, which was 4.1% of GDP. And this, of course, happens at the same time as we had back in the 80s and in the 90s, lots of resistance in various countries. Here are some of the ones you may have heard. I mean, in most of the countries where we had uprisings in the last few years, it was countries that were under IMF arrangements, including Kenya, Bangladesh. And in this regard, I mean, in the last few years, from the COM side, the IMF has been quite loud in its climate involvement, and the managing director has been attending COP. They launched the Climate Strategy in 2021, as I said before. They launched also the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is this add-on facility to rechannel special drawing rights, and through which the IMF designs climate policy conditionalities without being a party to the UNFCCC, without being a party to the Paris Agreement, and without, as Yolanda said, properly recognizing itself as part of the UN system, despite it being so. Reality, as we have seen with the continuous approach to austerity, the IMF continues to prioritize for countries policies to ensure debt repayments over fiscal space for climate and development. This is, on the one hand, we have this fiscal piece, but then we have also how is that IMF programs accelerate extractivism and therefore put at risk countries and disease. This is the case of Argentina, Ghana, Ecuador, various countries where the IMF staff clearly outline what are the benefits of increasing extractivism and accelerating extractivism in order to have the hard currency that is needed to repay debt, without properly analyzing what are the implications for the structure of the economy, what are the implications of relying on fossil fuel exports, a commodity that is extremely volatile, and of course, I mean, the entire energy policy is framed and has as a priority exporting rather than national development. And this is extremely, here you can see a graph from 2025 from one of the reports where you can see how is it that the IMF provides its lending. In these tiny dark blue bits, you can see what has been done under the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, this new facility that came up in 2022. This is the only lending in which the IMF has had a discussion on climate implications, and in the assessment stuff too, when they design the programs, they take climate policy, NDCs, national adaptation plans, they take it into account. The issue is what happens in the rest of the IMF lending, which is more than 95% of what the IMF does. And in those parts of its lending, the IMF does no climate assessments whatsoever. And you may say, how is it that the IMF claims that it has incorporated climate into its lending when 95% of it is excluded from this? Well, that's what an institution that it's absolutely unaccountable, that it's not party to the Paris Agreement or to the UNFCCC can do. And this is why the review of conditionalities right now, it's an extremely timely opportunity to have this discussion on what's effective IMF lending that supports climate goals and at least does not, or at least at the bare minimum, does not undermine climate goals could look like. Just to echo here quickly what Yolanda was saying, this is you'll find the link in the presentation. of a letter from the managing director to OHCHR, the UN Office on Human Rights, where the IMF clearly outlines that it has not accepted the Declaration on Human Rights, but rather that through the activities that they decide to do, they support human rights indirectly, which of course, as we know well, it's false. But what's also, from a context perspective, what's problematic right now is that what has been done has been extremely little, but has allowed space for us to have some kind of discussions. But right now, even that little progress that was done is under attack by the Trump administration. The Trump administration has appointed as a deputy managing director at the IMF, Dan Katz, who used to be the chief of staff of the US Treasury Secretary. And here are some quotes from statements of the US Treasury Secretary saying that the IMF should stop working on climate, should stop working on gender altogether. And just to finish, here you will find some links to documents that we put up together with various allies in civil society, with concrete recommendations on how to frame, how to approach these two processes. In the case of the comprehensive surveillance review, in general, the approach that we have, given the IMF's reluctance to properly abide by UN principles, by UNFCCC principles, we rather advocate for a do no harm approach to ensure that whatever the IMF does not undermine countries' human rights, development, and climate goals, rather than having the IMF taking the lead in these issues, because the economists, the PhD economists from Ivy League universities that are in DC are definitely not the people that should be designing these kinds of policies. Ensuring that there's CSO engagement, also ensuring collaboration with UN agencies, and of course the Paris Agreement piece here is essential, because the Paris Agreement is clear around how is it that all IMF lending has to support the Paris Agreement, and not only these tiny dark blue bits. And of course, other colleagues, other organizations work ensure that we also support goals around social spending. The IMF has also tried to clean its image on its lack of support for social spending, and yes, we try to see all of these issues holistically. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to respond any questions. Last thing, here's the website. You can sign up for any advocacy updates, because there you'll find out how is that you can support all of the efforts we're doing for these reviews this year.
Thank you so much, Fede, for outlining all these challenges in relation to the IMF, and actually to what extent civil society can or cannot do damage control and navigating within all those interactions, which actually poses the question, what does it mean in terms of for the current geopolitics, multilateralism, and for the future of the UN, what are the spaces that we have to continue to advocate with these agendas? So within this framework, I would like to invite Shireen Talat from MENA Fem to take us through some reflections. Shireen, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, and thanks a lot for my friends and colleagues who already shared very valuable intels and informations. Well, I will speak from a political economy lens and from our realities on the Swana region as well. Here, to be able to understand how we how this space for us means, we need to understand we are not facing a coordination gap between institutions. We are facing a structural crisis of global financial governance. The UN space speak the language of climate justice. The IMF continues to enforce fiscal discipline shaped by critical priorities. The result is widening contradictions between climate ambition and macroeconomics practice. So that brings us to the crisis of multilateralism. So across the UNFCCC and the FFD, or financing and development process, countries demand trillions for climate adaptation and loss and damage. At the same time, IMF programs still prioritize debt sustainability ratios, fiscal consolidations, and market confidence indicators. This creates a structural lock. climate vulnerable countries must invest in water system, food sovereignty, and energy transition. But IMF frameworks restrict public spending through deficit targets and subsidized reform. Subsidy reform. Um, so when it comes to the Swana region in Morocco, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Tunisia, climate stress grows while public budgets shrink under adjustments pressures. UNCTAD with some of our colleagues here, like Eurodad and Did Justice, different research shows that many global South countries now spend more on debt servicing than on climate action. This is not a policy um, uh, in inconsistency. It reflects financial architecture designed to protect creditor stability before human security. So we need to ask ourselves here a direct question. Can climate justice exist inside an economical model that treats public investment as a fiscal risk? Going to the IMF and the technical limits of climate integration, the IMF expanded its climate discourse through surveillance, as my colleagues already mentioned, and resilience and sustainability trust. Yet the core macroeconomic framework remains unchanged. Technically, three problems stand out. First, climate risk enters Article 4's consultation as a stability variable, not as a justice issue. Second, lending instruments rely heavily on loans, increasing sovereign debt burdens. Third, governance reform stalls because voting power remains uh, concentrated among a few economies. In practice, that means climate policies becomes conditional on austerity pathways. Energy subsidies reform tied to IMF programs often ignore gendered impact and unpaid care and household costs. Public investments ceiling limit adaptation infrastructure even when climate risk rises. From a feminist economic perspective, this macro framework erase social reproduction and care economies from fiscal analysis. So the IMF calls this stabilization. Communities experience it as social contractions. When it comes to the UN system in its political ceiling, UN space still matter and very important because they shape norms. COP negotiations push climate finance narrative. FFD debates challenge debt architecture and the creditor dominance. Global South coalitions demand structural reform. But the UN does not control the IMF quotas or lending rules. This creates a dual system. So political legitimacy sits in the UN process. Financial authorities sits in institutions governed by creditor blocks. And civil society, as already my colleagues illustrated and highlights, working across both arena, and that work across those arenas is a must. Use UN platforms to shift discourse, apply pressure where financial decisions actually occur. The G20 and the is a key player on this architecture of exclusion. So the G20 continues to shape IMF directions behind closed doors. Debt restructuring under common framework remains slow and fragmented. Private creditors resist participation. Borrowers countries struggle to coordinate. For climate justice movement, this means COP outcomes alone will not shift financial flows. We need engagement more with the IMF review process, quota database, and debt negotiations at the same time. Otherwise, climate advocacy risks become symbolic while macroeconomics rules remain intact. From our work at MENA Fem through the Rabat roadmap, the outcomes of the Global Feminist Gathering last year, putting our feminist alternatives on as our approach on climate finance for us is a systematic economic question, not only a sectorial issue. The roadmap, the Rabat roadmap, emerged from regional feminist economic organizing. It calls for structural transformation of the financial architecture. The key pillars include debt cancellation and restructuring linked to climate vulnerability, public finance model that prioritize care economies, food system and local resilience, democratic governance of climate finance with gender justice indicators, a shift away from loan-based climate funding towards grant-based public investment. Through our feminist economics schools, policy research, and regional alliance, we at MENA Fem are trying to build political education around IMF programs, shape climate outcomes on the ground. It also shows that macroeconomic rules determine who adopts and who absorbs the costs of crisis. So alternative spaces are already emerging. Borrowers coordination efforts that challenge creditor dominance are already trying to set a new discussion around who's deciding whose life matters more. And I can see also the feminist alliances like linking debt justice with climate reparations debates and regional networks producing independent analysis outside the traditional financial institutions. These initiatives do not wait for institutional reform. They actually create pressure from below. So our strategic priorities from our feminist lens for the 2026 is moving towards the annual meetings and the COP process. Civil society needs a sharper strategy, link IMF review cycle to demand emerging from the FFD negotiations, push for macroeconomic indicators that includes inequality, unpaid care, and ecological risk, strengthening South-South coordination to shift negotiations power, use capacity building platforms to demystify IMF language and expose political implications. The real struggle is not about better climate language in financial reports. It is about redefining fiscal space itself. So, from this perspective, multilateralism will not collapse overnight, but it will lose legitimacy if climate vulnerable societies continue to face austerity, well-being, while being asked to transition their economies, which is doesn't make any sense, and deepening the whole of injustice that was built on this neoliberal system. In the Rabat roadmap, we offer a different directions: a financial architecture grounded in justice, public investment centered on people and planet, and feminist economic framework that challenge the power structures shaping global finance today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I really commend of the work and how fantastic the Rabat roadmap is, really as a tool to connect the dots in terms of challenging the economics, the neoliberal system, but especially how much, I think, from what you said, and in fact all the speakers said, how connecting the dots between the multiple spaces is really important. We don't have really much time for questions, but there is one question in the Q&A function by Punina that I would like to bring to you. If you could respond and also share a few reflections. I mean, I would love to spend hours continuing the discussion, but given the limited time, let's go for it. So the question is, what do you see as key moments or forums for CSOs to advance on the agenda this year, given the current geopolitical context? Is it helpful to move beyond the UNFCCC, and also how and where? So yeah, it would be great to have, if in 1 minute each, due to time, for our speakers to share reflections and respond to this. So yeah, I'll go back to Yolanda. Over to you. Thanks.
Here, sorry, I couldn't find the microphone. Thank you. Maybe I can ask the issue also of ecological debt and the IMF in relation to climate, because this is something that obviously with the IMF, the calls for the recognition and restitution of ecological climate debt, historical debt, don't resonate in the institution, nor at the officials level, nor at the management level, neither at the board level. But I think it's an argument that we can use in our narrative to make sure they comply with their climate obligations, so they don't become further ecological and climate debtors. That being said, there's been also this endless discussion about how the IMF should get involved or not involved in climate issues. We don't want the IMF to be the leader of climate finance or climate action. We just need them to not do any further harm, to have climate into consideration when they do their own policies. And so we're not asking for the IMF to become a climate finance provider, just that their finance is climate aligned. I'll leave it there. I see your face, Mariana. My minute has passed. Sorry.
Sorry to play the bad guy. And also thanks also for 2 additional questions that came. One from Julia from Farm. What about the green conditionalities and in terms of false solutions? And the second one from Rakesh. What about the ICJ advisory opinion having an impact on MDBs? If any other the panelists want to also touch on this. Thank you. And Sarah, over to you. Sorry.
I think I'll respond to the first question and just bake in my closing remark there. I don't think it's a matter of what are the entry points if we leave the UNFCCC behind, because that does remain the single space where someone from an island country gets, at least on paper, equal footing and a voice and a seat at the table. I know that's a whole separate conversation on what's not working, and that's important to highlight, but I think there is a role to play. I think it's worth it to take the hooks that Belém has given us as civil society and put some energy into it, whether that's trying to steer what the Veredas dialogue looks like for Paris alignment of finance flows, or continuing pressure on making Article 9.5, which is the transparency article of the Paris Agreement, for ensuring that provider countries are held accountable in ways that is necessary and scrutiny is actually upheld, or just continuing to ask for a better roadmap to 1.3. And now there's a growing conversation among CSOs on even really looking at the estimates, like including the ones we used by the IH leg or the independent high level group of experts, and the estimates of climate finance needs that they brought out, looking at that critically. I mean, everything has a role and a time and all of that, but I think it's still worth putting in some energy with the UNFCCC. That being said, given the current geopolitical moment, just 20 seconds, Mariana, I think it's also worth giving some thought and energy to the BRICS. What we're hearing and the intel I got from a call recently was that the Indian presidency might not put out, anything too tangible on IF reform or economic governance reform. But that's not because these countries don't think these two are priority. They're high priority for them. But a lot of their energy right now is being spent to respond to the tariff wars and everything else that the geopolitical moment today is throwing at them. So we need to be realistic, but keep asking, because civil society pushes the envelope, and then if you ask for the stars, maybe you get near the moon, you know the rest. Okay, stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. Fede, over to you.
Yes, I'll be really brief. I think if there's something problematic in the IMF's approach to climate policy, is that it has never, I mean, as it has happened with economic, social, cultural rights, the institution is not showing willingness to do things differently, but rather it's thinking how to continue doing things as it has done, and thinking how to label those as climate friendly. And I think that's like we have some structural issues there. Also, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, it's quite broad, and we don't have a clear definition of climate finance. And we don't have any clear definition, guidance on how we see that climate finance needs to be. We have a view and a vision from civil society, but I think that's where we have to be always ultra cautious in what is it that these institutions do in the name of climate, and we have to hold them accountable for what they do. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Last but not the least, Shireen, please bring us to a close.
Yes, I mean, because I was connecting the dots from our perspective. So we cannot keep treating climate debt and development as a separate conversation. The UN debates just as the IMF sets fiscal rules, the G20 shapes decision behind closed doors. So in this space if this space remains disconnected, a lot of things will be lost. A lot of fights and the struggles will be lost, and we will be more soaked in our austerity reality. Governance is not a technical detail. It demands who speaks. It actually determines who speaks, who votes, and who carries the cost of crisis. So today, small group of creditors of credit pools still define risks, define stability, and define what countries are allowed to invest in. That's why adaptation remains underfunded, and why climate finance turns into new debt. So connecting spaces means more than coordination. It means shifting powers. Linking COP outcomes to also the IMF review process, bringing debt justice demands from the FFD into financial negotiations is very important. And again, in ensuring feminist and the global South movements shape governance reform, not just respond to it. So it's very important to have this question on whether we build enough collective pressure across all the arenas to make governance accountable to people and planet, or just fight in silos. It's very important to be able to know how to do this connection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you all for participating. And breaking the silos, just like as you're saying, is exactly what we're doing here. Through the process, we do our campaigning and advocacy, through the cross-movement building and organizing that we have been doing. So thank you all for participating, also for all the resources being shared. As Federica said, this is just the first webinar of the series, and I look forward to see you more, work with you more throughout the year. Thanks a lot for coming again, and have a good rest of your day.